all these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator.
Welcome back to the BC Law Just Law podcast. I'm Tom Blakely. I'm here with Jim Fiore and Professor Brian Quinn. Today we're talking about Microsoft, specifically its acquisition of the company Activision. It's been making the headlines in M&A circles, business circles, attracting the attention of regulators, gamers, tech, and just everybody, it seems like, is talking about this deal. So we want to talk about what's going on, some of the complications, some of the things that have been in the news when it comes to what's going on with these two companies. But first of all, Professor, thanks for joining us. Before we get started, we just wanted to talk a little about you. I know you teach M&A here. You're kind of the guy when it comes to this topic. But anything you'd want folks to know about you, what you study, what you teach, and you told me before we got started about how much you've been talking about this deal in your class this semester. What has that been like?
Yeah, so I teach corporate law, mergers and acquisitions, and venture capital, so in the business law space here at the law school. And I also research in the area of mergers and acquisitions in particular. So I spend a lot of time thinking about the legal issues surrounding deals like this. And as part of my regular M&A class, we typically take a deal that's in the news any given semester, and we follow that through the course of the semester, so we can understand what the legal issues are, and we can see them play out in real life.
Sure.
And this semester, we've been looking at a couple of deals, including the Activision deal.
Sure. So why is this such a massive deal? I mean, the billing you see in headlines is record deal, blockbuster deal. Like, what makes this deal so significant?
Well, one, size.
Right.
It's a $68 billion or $69 billion deal, which in the software space is really big. And it's certainly Microsoft's largest deal by dollar value that they've done to date. So they've not done anything this big. So it's going to grab attention anyway, right? Just because of its size. But there are other issues going on surrounding it. But the size is really what draw people's attention right away.
Yeah. Now, why would these companies do this deal now? I mean, these are both well-established companies in their industries. Obviously, Microsoft, which has had an evolution through the years in technology. Activision is just a gaming powerhouse. Why does this deal make sense right now for these two companies?
Well, Activision, for its own reasons, has got issues.
Yeah.
Right? So they're at a crossroads that they're where it's probably the right time for them to think about going in, not staying independent. But for Microsoft, there are a couple of things going on here, right? On the one hand, they think, the metaverse.
Mm-hmm.
What is that? We have to be a part of it. And gaming gives them at least an opportunity to be part of that, right?
Yeah.
The metaverse. So they're looking at this as, in part, a way to solidify their foothold in the future, whatever that is. Right? No one really knows, but gaming is certainly going to be a part of that. And then, second, it's a bigger play with respect to Microsoft and the whole structure of the gaming business.
Mm-hmm.
So put the metaverse aside. If you're Microsoft, you've been through these battles before with respect to your operating system. Apple on the one side with the walled garden,
Mm-hmm.
and Microsoft a little bit more open and trying to go that way. And what they're doing here with Activision is they're making a bet on an open system. So where Sony was going to require you to continue to buy the Sony.
Mm-hmm. Within their ecosystem.
Right. This is going to give Microsoft an ability to get to everybody, mobile, all sorts of devices, in a way that's kind of familiar for Microsoft in terms of the way they've attacked the operating system market.
So I had two questions about each of these companies, and then we'll go to Jim. The first one is, I was reading a Wall Street Journal article recently. It was, I believe the headline was, how Microsoft became Washington's favorite tech company. If you saw this, and they talked about Microsoft President Brad Smith cultivating, positive relationships in Washington recently. At a time where tech companies generally, really Microsoft's rivals are really soured and sort of found themselves in the crosshairs of regulators. And it, at one point in time, years ago, Microsoft was the poster child of an antitrust tech violator, the kind of people who would have a hard time pulling off this deal. And the article in the Journal argued how, at this point, Microsoft might be the only company, as opposed to Amazon or Google or Facebook, who could get away with a deal like this. Why is that? Why would regulators look a little bit more favorably at Microsoft acquiring Activision as opposed to Facebook or Google or somebody else?
Yeah, so Microsoft has, since it went through its antitrust trial, it's been a quiet player.
Mm-hmm.
They've been obviously they're a big player, but they've not been as aggressive and as in your face as some of the more recent big tech companies. But that doesn't say they're going to be able to get away with it. Away with it. They're not going to be able to get this deal done without compromise. This is a deal that's comes along at the wrong time for anybody in tech looking to do a large transaction.
Yeah.
It's attracting and will continue to attract attention, not just from the FTC, but also from Congress and others. So it's really the wrong time to do a huge deal.
Yeah. And Jim, I think you want to ask about the process of doing the deal.
Yeah. So where are we actually in the process? Because I mean, a deal like this, is there any normal process? And you can't really predict how long it'll take, but where are we now in the process? And
you have a general idea how long it's going to take. So in this deal or any deal like this, first they'll negotiate and then sign a merger contract. That contract, that process might take a few months as they go through due diligence. And they figure out, well, what's this company got going? What are the issues, right? And then once it's signed, typically you're required to make a filing with the federal government if it's a deal of a certain size, and this is clearly one of them, for the federal government to review the transaction for purposes of antitrust. And if it's not an antitrust-sensitive transaction, after 30 days or so, the federal government's going to give you a wave off, and you can go off and finish the deal. But this is a deal where the parties clearly anticipated that the government would care. And if the government cares, they'll issue what's called a second request, where they essentially back up all the semi-trucks. Years ago, it used to be all in paper. So it used to be these large trucks of documents. Now it's all in a few thumb drives, but nevertheless, it's a lot of material. It's 3 or 4 years worth of internal corporate documents that you have to send to the government. The government conducts additional investigations. That could take some time. At the end of perhaps 6 months or so, the government's going to make a determination. Do they want to sue you to block the transaction, or are they going to permit the transaction to go forward with some changes and the rest? So this is going to go on for at least 18 months.
Okay. And in this case, only the FTC is reviewing it, but sometimes the Justice Department can review it. And why is that? Why is there a difference there? When would one or the other agency look into a merger?
Yeah, so antitrust is concurrent jurisdiction between the Department of Justice Antitrust Division and the Federal Trade Commission, and informally they divvy up the deals, as it were. So consumer-facing deals tend to be reviewed by the FTC. So that includes software, bricks and mortars, factories, heavy industry goes to the DOJ. If and when there's a determination with respect to a criminal investigation with respect to antitrust, that always goes to the DOJ. But in these kind of deal approvals, they're handled as between the FTC and DOJ. They just split them internally as to who does the evaluation. In this case, it's the FTC.
Yeah.
So in terms of attracting the ire of the FTC, recently had Senators Warren, Sanders, Whitehouse, and Booker sent a letter to the FTC under Chairwoman Lena Khan, obviously under the Biden administration, under Khan's leadership. The FTC has got obviously a very different attitude towards regulation than under the Trump administration. So they had a few concerns. Number one, obviously, regarding the monopoly power, monopsony power, et cetera, of the deal, and sort of the rudiments of how regulators look at market power and will consumers be harmed, et cetera. But one of the other albatrosses, it seems like, for one of the companies in this deal, Activision, has been their culture problem. And obviously you read about what's been going on there and it's really troublesome, but the fact that it's so troublesome to where it, seems like it's, attracting scrutiny from regulators in terms of, how is the culture at this company, what happened, how is that affecting the deal you had? The senators also cited concerns over what it would mean for competition, saying as this proposed deal moves forward in the process, the FTC should assess whether the ways in which these companies have failed to protect the rights and dignity of their workers are driven by monopsony power or amount to anti-competitive harms in the market. Talking about, obviously, at Activision, there's been sexual harassment, just a lot of really messed up things at Activision. So I guess, how does that affect the deal, in terms of the culture problems at Activision, as well as, the traditional aspects of, the market and consumer harm and things you'd be concerned about?
Yeah, well, this earlier I said this is like the worst time to do a big deal like this. And the reason is this. At the time when this deal gets announced, the FTC, the DOJ within the Biden administration are going through a very public rethink of approaching antitrust enforcement. Since the 1970s, under Democratic and Republican administrations, there's been a consensus view that consumer welfare is the measuring stick. So if a transaction, a proposed merger, results in improved consumer welfare, so lower prices for consumers, well, that's fine. We're just going to let it happen, even if that means increasing consolidation of industry. Lena Khan and Tim Wu and others who are part of the Biden administration, they represent a different view with respect to the enforcement of antitrust. And they say, wait a minute, consumer welfare, what does that mean if you've got someone basically doing like every transaction is a loss leader? They bring in, they lose the money, they don't care, but the effect is they consolidate the market, they control the market, and they can affect prices up and down or they use your private information for their own purposes. Maybe we should take a rethink, they say, about like what it means, what are the competitive effects, and what we should be thinking about. And in particular, they think about things like the effect on labor of consolidated industries, and whether or not that's always the right choice. Whether that's always the right decision to allow these kinds of transactions to go forward. If the effect is to decrease the amount of potential employers out there for workers.
How much is the problems Activision has had inside their shop in terms of culture and just everything that's sort of taken over the headlines when it comes to Activision? How much of a role and what role has that played in this deal? And perhaps I think you alluded to Activision deciding, this is a time to change, especially in terms of leadership. There's Bobby Kotick, I believe his name is, has really been mired in all of this. I guess what role has Activision's problem played in this deal?
Well, it's really made them vulnerable, right?
Yeah.
So they've been enduring for the last couple of years just these sexual harassment issues that have been part of the frat bro culture of that particular company have just come to the fore, and they've just been in the headlines. When you look for like news about Activision prior to this deal, it was all about that.
Right.
And that's just a terrible look with respect to leadership. So there's a lot of calls inside the investment community about are these the right leaders for this particular company?
And these are Activision shareholders?
Maybe Activision shareholders, because it affects the stock price, obviously. And so there are people calling for change. And, at this point, that makes them vulnerable to an acquisition, or more amenable to an acquisition. If they can link up with Microsoft, Microsoft can take the lead on these kinds of issues and perhaps give the business some more time.
And how does the FTC take that into consideration? Because obviously FTC is looking at the harmed class potentially from this bigger company, but it's kind of like this separate tangential issue.
Yeah, I don't think the sexual harassment litigation per se is going to attract a lot of attention from the FTC. Mm-hmm. I think issues with respect to unionization, issues on the labor side more generally, might be the kind of thing that attract the FTC's attention. Issues with respect to use of consumer privacy, the effect on consumers of the transaction, would be the kind of thing that the FTC is going to pay attention to. And again, this is all in the new FTC, the new
Biden FTC.
The Biden FTC. Right. But the funny thing is that we might say it's the Biden FTC, but there is a weird coalition of forces that agree on very, very few things.
From opposite sides of the aisle, you're saying?
Opposite sides of the aisle. But when you say big tech, they all agree, that's something terrible. We should do something about that. So there are weird coalitions that could form around this. Yeah. So maybe not necessarily what Lena Khan wants, but Lena Khan and Marco Rubio suddenly together, Josh Hawley, Tom Cotton, all saying, we'll do something.
I mean, you had a couple of years ago, both, now President Biden and then President Trump both wanted to eliminate Section 230 to punish tech companies for very different reasons. Yeah. But it seems like everyone has a problem with big tech.
Yeah, everyone does, and so it's just a weird time, and no one really knows what the result will be. But it won't be what it was 2 years ago. With
respect to corporate law and in the responsibilities of the leadership of a corporation to shareholders, obviously Activision has. Hasn't been going in a good direction the last few years in terms of their leadership, the problems they've had. To the extent you're, familiar with this, how much has, shareholders of Activision, what role have they played in deciding that, changes needed to be made in terms of the leadership and the direction of the company? Or is this purely, Microsoft saying okay, we want to, you talked about the metaverse, this is a way we can compete. This is this is a time to strike. I guess, what are the origins of this deal relative to where each company stands? Yeah,
so Microsoft has their own business reasons for doing the deal, and from the point of view of a company like Activision, their stock has been hurt by the recent revelations just to their internal culture. And being able to sell the company for cash at a premium over the market price for stockholders, that's a pretty good solve for their wounds, right? For them to say, okay, I'll take $95 for my shares and let someone else worry about this going forward.
Yeah, I wanted to ask you something about, you mentioned a little bit before about the App Store changes and how they're trying to make their App Store more open, to distinguish themselves from Apple and Google, because Apple was in the news about a big lawsuit where they were taking 30% of every purchase. Is that normal to make these changes, right before a merger and as the FTC is looking into it?
So in the context of Microsoft, they basically pre-announced we're going to keep this open, because they know that the FTC is going to come after them and say, look, we're afraid that if you do this deal, you're going to prevent Sony users from playing these games unless they buy your set box, right? So they just put it out there. Look, we're not going to do that, and we're going to make this open to anybody as a way, I think, to reduce some fears on the side of the FTC that this is anti-competitive in that way.
Following up on the App Store point, you mentioned this idea of the walled gardens and the ecosystems earlier on. One development here, at least in the background for people who sort of follow these companies closely, there are a number of articles I've read about how Microsoft approached Apple, basically trying to get their Game Pass subscription into the App Store. I mean, obviously Apple's iOS, that's by far the predominant mobile operating system that people are on. Their ecosystem, the walled garden, obviously Epic Games and a lot of the issues Apple's having in terms of preserving that ecosystem with respect to threats in terms of regulation. The way that works, you can't have, if you're a company like Microsoft, you have a Game Pass subscription, you have a library of games, and you have sort of your own ecosystem. Microsoft cannot bring that onto iOS. You have to basically sell every game individually, and that's subjected to Apple's 30% cut. And so, Microsoft, as I understand it, was very interested in thinking like, okay, how do we, tap this market of iOS users who want to play our Xbox titles? So that did not work out. And so now you have, due to Apple's policies, which are obviously under fire right now. So then you have Microsoft going and, obviously seeing a growth opportunity with respect to Activision. So going forward, I mean, you have regulation on the one hand, you have, the metaverse and a lot of changes that are going on now. Where do you think, assuming Microsoft's able to complete this acquisition, the landscape that emerges on the other side of this, in terms of gaming, in terms of operating systems, walled gardens, like what does the future look like? You have abroad and domestically now who say, we need you can't just have the App Store be the only game in town. What kind of future are we going towards here in terms of the marketplace and competition?
It's an open question, right? Yeah. Because these are the same long-term bets that people made with respect to operating systems years ago, right? Walled garden versus more open system. Microsoft is again, the Xbox, to the extent that was a walled garden, they're moving away from that into a more open approach to their gaming systems, which is, I guess, familiar territory for them almost. But how it's going to this is all going to be played out in the marketplace in front of us, and certainly the government's going to have a voice in this with respect to the FTC and the DOJ and how they think about the walled gardens going forward. But it's the same old almost for both of these companies over the years.
Another question I had. So obviously you talk about we're talking about sort of the trajectory here of these companies, and Microsoft in particular. Microsoft itself, I think it's interesting. We spoke early on about how at one point Microsoft was the villain in terms of antitrust, and sort of someone that lawmakers would look upon with a lot of scrutiny. But you've had when you look at their competitors, you look at it to the extent they are competitors. Amazon, Google, Apple, all these other big tech companies, as it were. It does feel like, from a business strategy standpoint, Microsoft over the last few years has differentiated itself and managed to stay out of the fray and avoid the ire of lawmakers in a way that seems like none of their peers have been able to. Why is that? What does it say about the market, about Microsoft? Are they doing things differently? I know, obviously they don't operate a social network. They're not in surveillance capitalism, which is something that's an issue.
Well, I think
what are they doing?
I think that's exactly it.
Yeah.
I mean, because they were the biggest fish in town for a long time, still are big fish, right?
In terms of profit, they're the biggest fish in town. But in terms of keeping
what they didn't do is they were unsuccessful in their attempts to get into the social network game. I mean, I suspect if they were able to jump in early and succeed, they would have been there and been just as hated as everybody else.
Right.
But the social networks that did get traction and succeed, they're the ones that are attracting all the attention that Microsoft used to have, because it would insert itself into your operating system and the browser wars and all the rest. But that was overtaken by the social networks, and I think they're probably pretty happy that they missed that boat. I mean, they're still in the game; they're doing very, very well. But now they're going to get back in, and they're getting back in at a very high profile. Well, so Target's coming back.
And as far as Microsoft President Brad Smith kind of creating relationships and friendships with Congress, do you think that's another part of the way they were able to kind of stay under the radar? And do you think, they would start creating new rules and regulations to avoid that? Yeah,
it's a good question. I mean, all the tech companies, I think, constitutionally, they feel like we're on the West Coast. The mountains are high and the emperor is far away. We do what we want to do out here, right? But they all have made investments, different kinds of investments in their in their DC-based lobbying operations. And with varying success. And I think, like, you just look at what Facebook has done, and they've been very, very aggressive, very partisan in terms of their hiring. And Microsoft has been able to get away with first not being in the attention sphere, right? Because they're not on not very aggressive in social networks, but also probably a little smarter in terms of fewer firebrands, right, in their hiring.
Because like you said, they're not on social media, but I mean, and this isn't to say they haven't been profitable, they haven't been successful. They're just in business to business cloud service, things that are relatively unremarkable. They're not, issues like kids getting addicted to TikTok and just sort of all the things that we're used to hearing about now. So it's really interesting. The last question I had, there was one Flashpoint issue that came up recently, a matter of insider trading, where you had film and music executive David Geffen on January 14th, so 4 days before the merger is announced on the 18th, buys $108 million worth of stock, $40 a share or so. Call options, right. SEC is looking into that. What do you know about that? Can that interfere with a deal like this at all? Is it simply a matter of bad press, or what's going on with that?
So that's not likely going to interfere with the execution of the transaction. But the facts, as we know them, involve Geffen, Barry Diller, and Alex von Furstenberg. So as it turns out, Alex von Furstenberg is the stepson of Barry Diller. Barry Diller sits on the board of Coca-Cola, or did sit on the board of Coca-Cola with Bobby Kotick, the CEO of Activision. And in the week prior to them doing this purchase of in-the-money call options at $40, Alex von Furstenberg had a breakfast with Bobby Kotick, where they say they did not discuss this transaction. But nevertheless, they did this deal. So it's very fishy. And it's the kind of thing that immediately draws the attention of regulators once they go through the trades.
Okay. Well, that's all I had, Jim.
Yeah, I just want to ask you, it's more of like a business strategy question about, the pros and cons of this Microsoft growing through acquisition as opposed to organic growth. Do you have any thoughts on the pros and cons of that?
Well, that's, make or buy is a regular decision that corporations may have to encounter, and the buy decision's a very common decision. If you can outsource risk, so development of a particular resource that you think might or might not be profitable, you outsource that to a third party, and just pick up, pay for the winners, as it were. That's a very successful strategy for lots of companies. Every business, every successful business will have a business development arm, and that business development arm is constantly engaging and asking the question: is there someone out there who we can acquire who can make our business more profitable? So the acquisition strategy is part of every strong business.
Yeah, and part of that strategy is, would you say, thinking through potential bad press of going through a merger or not an investigation, but just like a review?
Yeah, more than bad press. It's every time there's a merger decision, a buy decision. Part of that decision is, what's the risk of this not happening because of X, Y, or Z? Z usually being the government saying no.
Just one last point, just to sort of bring everything home. So we've talked about Microsoft's rivals, and that these companies probably have a much harder time completing this acquisition. Let's just kind of run that hypo through as something that obviously people will think about. Let's say Apple decided, what, we really want to do more with gaming. We want to get into the metaverse too, or Amazon or any of these other companies decides it. Obviously the first thing you think about is, these companies are from a regulatory standpoint can't catch a break. Like every day they're getting into trouble. And you've had this lately, Amazon with you. Amazon's in the news every day for something terrible, whether it's unions or just their contract workers, or obviously Google's had its fair share of problems. Facebook, all these companies have been taken to the cleaners in the last few years in Washington. But I guess from a if you can help us understand what FTC or DOJ look at when they're reviewing a merger to figure out, obviously the effect on the market, the effect on consumers. What is it about Microsoft doing this deal that is perhaps a little bit less odious with respect to the marketplace and potential harms than other companies, besides the fact those companies themselves are just under more scrutiny these days and are a little bit less popular in town?
I don't think that Microsoft is got any sort of special armor here. They're not the big bad boy that they used to be in that regard, right? So, but there are real issues, with respect to the transaction. And I could imagine, even if the FTC and the DOJ were not in the midst of a reorganization or a redirection of their policy, I can imagine that this transaction would, from a consumer welfare point of view, also draw lots of attention, because someone's going to say, "Hey, wait a minute, what's the what assurance do we have as market regulators that you're not going to create a walled garden and prevent people from playing these games anymore unless they pay for your service?" And so we want some sort of assurance before you do this deal. So that was good. I think that was going to happen anyway. And part of the reason why Microsoft said we're going to make this open is to deflect from that kind of criticism. So it's so this is a deal that's got issues. It's got to overcome. They've got to win over regulators to ensure that they're going to be able to meet not just the consumer welfare standard, but also these other new issues with respect to all the upstream problems.
Very good. Well, it's certainly an interesting deal to talk about and an interesting deal to watch going forward. Well, that's been the BC Law Just Law podcast. Again, I'm Tom Blakely, this is Jim Fiore, and we've been lucky enough to talk to Professor Brian Quinn about Microsoft and Activision and everything that's going on there. Until next time, that'll do it, and thank you for tuning in.